Sis, your husband is here." Just as I was confidently talking about my expertise in managing my partner while casually cross-legged, my younger sister suddenly interjected with this line. And then I found myself being dragged away by Robert Carmen by the collar of my shirt. As I was leaving, I still made sure to explain to my little sister that it was all a misunderstanding, just our way of living together. Clearly, she didn't believe me. I didn't believe it myself. Before Robert Carmen was a dog, he actually looked quite human. A month ago, I entered into a business partnership of a marriage of convenience with Robert Carmen. At first, everything went normally and we kept our distance. But recently Robert Carmen started getting a bit handsy. Don't get me wrong, I mean it in the literal sense. Just a moment ago, when he first dragged me out, he didn't forget to give me a kick on his way out. He really is a dog. You must be wondering why I would get involved with this scumbag. I found myself curious as well. So the first thing I did was ask him that question. Robert Carmen replied that it was because he had money. Oh right, he has money. Money. I thought, you can't go against money forever. So I chose to continue living with Robert Carmen. I also asked him why he chose to throw his money at me out of everyone. Robert Carmen said it was because he had looked at me a bit longer. How pretentious. Then Robert Carmen finally got realistic. He said it was because I was good looking. I don't believe him for a second. Let me clarify, I am indeed good looking, but I didn't look great when I first met Robert Carmen. That morning, I had just broken up with my boyfriend of 2 years. When my mom found out, she was overjoyed, dancing around and saying she always thought my ex was a loser and he really ended up cheating. So good riddance and new beginnings. Later that afternoon, Robert Carmen showed up. He sat across from me, listening as I cried and cursed my ex-boyfriend for hours. I cried until my makeup was a mess, smudging several packs of tissues that Robert Carmen had to hand me. When I had calmed down a bit, Robert Carmen finally spoke up, asking if I wanted to marry him, while handing me a contract. Then he listened to me cry and insult him for half the night. So, our blind date lasted from 3 in the afternoon to 9 at night. If it had lasted any longer, my mom would have assumed we went straight to the honeymoon suite. So when she opened the door and saw me back home, she looked especially surprised. I could read the disappointment in her eyes. Robert Carmen was introduced to me by one of my mom's good friends, who praised him endlessly. Handsome, an elite lawyer, the nation's husband. In short, she used every cliché from romantic dramas. So by the time I met Robert Carmen, I was already expecting him to be incompetent, handsome, hard to look at, elite lawyer. These days, any lawyer claims to be elite. The nation's husband, how shameless. When I finally met Robert Carmen, it turned out that I had been overly pessimistic. For the first time, I felt my mom wasn't completely off the mark, due to his stunning looks. When Robert Carmen dropped me off outside my building, I seriously considered his proposal. Oddly enough, I didn't even curse him out and just nodded in agreement. But Robert Carmen was quite unreasonable. The next morning before I was even awake, he showed up at my door with an assortment of gifts, effectively winning over the heart of his mother-in-law. When my mom dragged me out of bed and into the living room, I was still groggy. And then I saw Robert Carmen, and my confusion only deepened. He smiled at me with warm, affectionate eyes and gently asked how my consideration was going. My mom also gazed at Robert Carmen with the same affectionate look, asking how my thought process was progressing. Robert Carmen was quite the talent. He maintained a straight face and said, "Auntie, I'm asking Joan Austen if she's thought about marrying me." I was completely without words. Fortunately, my mom was quick to act. Without another word, she slapped my ID card and household registration book into Robert Carmen's hands. Once said, impossible to take back. I checked the calendar. Today is a good day for marriage registration. And then she pushed me and Robert Carmen out the door. We stood by the entrance, staring at each other. He clearly didn't expect my mom to be so eager to help me out the door. I didn't foresee myself being so flustered every time I met Robert Carmen. The first time, I was a crying mess. The second time, I was bare-faced, in pajamas and slippers, with unbrushed teeth, unwashed face, and hair looking like a bird's nest. Then Robert Carmen looked at me and smiled. Great, he smiled. A gentleman seeks revenge, even after 10 years. But for a woman, Revenge is instantaneous. I perched my legs over one another in the passenger seat of Robert Carmen's car, directing him toward the Civil Affairs Bureau. At that moment, Robert Carmen complied surprisingly well, even taking the time to inform me that once the official seal was stamped, there was no turning back. Of course, I had no intention of turning back. I wanted to marry him, and to torment him for the rest of his life. The big sister at the Civil Affairs Bureau had a keen eye. She asked us repeatedly if we wanted to get married voluntarily. To be precise, she asked Robert Carmen several times, and he nodded silently every time. As the big sister stamped the form, she couldn't help but glance at the well-dressed Robert Carmen, then turned to me, who looked like a mess, and said, "What a pity for such a good-looking guy. Turns out he's a mute." Truly, what goes around comes around. I laughed until I almost cried, and didn't hesitate to express to the big sister how tough life was, stating that not only was Robert Carmen mute, but his brain wasn't functioning well either. When the big sister handed me the certificate, she grabbed my hand, encouraging me to live well, saying there would always be hope, then looked at the sullen Robert Carmen with pity. Once we stepped out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, Robert Carmen stared at me, who was still laughing non-stop, and coolly said, "Is marrying a mute really that exciting?" I replied, "So exciting. In my lifetime, I can finally hear a mute speak. What a medical miracle." Robert Carmen's face darkened further, and then he sped off with his car. I couldn't help but sigh again. This man is really a dog. When I got a taxi back home, the house was empty. My mom had already packed all my things in record time, and neatly arranged them at the door, leaving behind a note. "I'm going on a trip with your dad. A married daughter is like water spilled on the ground. You should come home less in the future." I looked up at the sky, wondering what on earth was happening. I sat on the sofa, opening the bright red marriage certificate. The photo in the upper right corner, stamped in red, was quite comical, a well-dressed CEO alongside a disheveled woman in pajamas. This was my first time carefully examining Robert Carmen. I must say, this man really is handsome, with rare sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes, the corners of his eyes slightly upturned, giving him an alluring charm. His thin lips pressed tight, yet upon closer inspection, one could notice a slight smirk. I gently caressed his face, thinking how nice it would be if he truly were mute. My handsome mute man, that would be something. Half an hour later, my mute husband appeared. "Are you that eager?" I scoffed and picked up the marriage certificate to throw at him. "What do you want?" But the paper just floated gently, drifting down to land softly at Robert Carmen's feet. It lacked even a fraction of the intimidation I had hoped for, and it seemed, in a way, like I was being a bit coy. Sure enough, Robert Carmen was quite perceptive. He watched me with ill intention, slowly bent down to pick up the paper, grinning in a way that made me uneasy. "I came to fulfill your expectations. Get lost." I couldn't take it anymore, and threw my slipper at him. Robert Carmen tilted his head to dodge, then walked straight towards me. I was terrified, convinced this man might just retaliate, but he didn't. He simply sat beside me, pulling out 2 pieces of paper from his pocket. I glanced over and saw it was the prenuptial agreement he'd handed me on our blind date, a document I hadn't even looked at before tossing aside. I swallowed hard, thinking he was about to start discussing rights and duties. Sure enough, Robert Carmen began to speak. "Did you read this contract?" I nodded. "Do you have any questions?" I shook my head. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" I was conflicted, nodding and shaking my head at the same time. Robert Carmen couldn't take it anymore, and became concerned. "Did you go mute?" I looked at him and started using gestures. Suddenly Robert Carmen leaned in, his hands gripping my arms as we were close enough that I could see the fine hairs on his face, and watch his mouth move. "Speak." Then I found myself drawn in and stupidly spoke up. "I'm afraid you might sell me out." Robert Carmen raised an eyebrow. "HMM." I began reciting lines I had heard on TV dramas. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you, in a court of law." Robert Carmen looked completely bewildered. "That line is from the police." Crap, I mixed up my TV dramas. I smiled awkwardly at Robert Carmen, trying to lighten the uncomfortable atmosphere. "I won't sell you out. After all, you're not worth that much. Ha ha ha. This guy is truly a dog." And thus, we seriously began to study the dog's marriage agreement. Firstly, the two of us will maintain a contractual relationship after marriage. Aside from fulfilling basic duties as husband and wife, we must not act out of line and must not interfere in each other's lives. I asked, what are the basic duties? Robert Carmen replied, I'll act filial in front of your mom, and you'll present as a loving wife in front of others. I inquired, what about my dad? Robert Carmen looked annoyed. That doesn't matter. Fine. I nodded in agreement, indicating the first condition was acceptable. Secondly, we are to maintain decorum after marriage. During the marriage, neither party is allowed to have flirty or extramarital relationships. If found, the other party may choose to void the marriage. I patted my chest and told Robert Carmen that as long as he didn't cheat on me, I would never give him a hard time. Article 3. The property of both parties shall remain independent before and after marriage, and each party will control their own income and bear their own debts. I looked at this clause and fell into deep thought. A minute later, I turned to Robert Carmen and asked very seriously, you said you're rich? Robert Carmen nodded. I asked, how rich are we talking about? He held up 5 fingers, his expression inscrutable. 50 million, I guessed. Robert Carmen remained noncommittal. Truth be told, I felt a pang of jealousy. I tore up the contract on the table and threw the pieces right at Robert Carmen's face. You're really cheap. I'm marrying you, playing along with your charade, putting up with so much. I deserve something for my troubles. If you're not giving me a single penny, then I'm not signing this contract or getting married. Let's just get a divorce. Robert Carmen calmly lifted his hand to brush away the scraps of paper I had thrown at him and said coolly, look at clause 4. I put my hands on my hips, glaring down at him. I won't look. I won't look. I want a divorce. Clause 4 states that during the marriage, Party A, Robert Carmen, shall pay Party B, Joan Austen, 20,000 yuan per month for living expenses, which will be at Party B's disposal. This was. I hurriedly brushed the paper off Robert Carmen's hair and shifted to a very gentle tone. Oh, why didn't you say so earlier? It's like a flood washing away the Dragon King temple. We're all family here. I knew Robert Carmen wasn't short on cash. And with those looks, how could you be so stingy? Robert Carmen looked at me, his face shifting from green to purple, quickly experiencing the warmth and coldness of human relationships. Money can persuade anyone. Money could stick me to the contract. Robert Carmen watched as I crouched by the table, carefully taping the contract back together. Joan Austen. This was the first time Robert Carmen called me by my full name. I flinched, my heart racing, a shock coursing through my body. I felt a little dazed. Joan Austen. Only then did I snap back to reality and look at him. Robert Carmen gazed at me, his eyes filled with an unexplainable emotion. Are you really that short on money? I seemed to see sympathy in his eyes. What a great opportunity. I began to fake my emotions, forcing out 2 tears, putting on a pitiful act as I recounted my tragic life story. I talked about being bullied at school, mistreated by friends as I grew older, and lacking love from either parent. Robert Carmen watched me, his expression fluctuating before he interrupted my tale. Joan Austen. Heh. Robert Carmen stared at me unblinkingly. You're overdoing it. I smiled sheepishly and said, sorry about that. And so, I began my cohabitation with Robert Carmen. I must say, Robert Carmen is truly wealthy. In the prime real estate of Shanghai, he managed to have a spacious flat. The 5 he held up might not have been 50 million, but 5 billion. Turns out, I underestimated his stature. I started to question my life. Do lawyers really make that much money? Robert Carmen cleared my doubts, saying it wasn't his wealth but his parents' wealth. Oh, an heir to a fortune. That's fine by me. I felt my life's perspective elevate once again. But I had another question. Why was a guy like Robert Carmen getting involved in a marriage of convenience? He mentioned it was to deal with his parents' marriage pressure. They had settled in America and were worried about him being alone in the country. But I found this excuse unconvincing. In my analysis, there are 2 possible reasons. 1. He might have been hurt by a woman in the past, and he's still healing from that emotional wound, unable to start a new relationship. 2. He might not like women. From my observations over the past few days, Robert Carmen indeed had very few female friends. His closest companion is Troy Hart, his college roommate and law firm partner. This solidified my second theory. Robert Carmen definitely falls into the latter category, but he probably finds it embarrassing to admit, so whenever I see them together, I purposely give them space, flashing an "I get it" expression. As time went on, Robert Carmen started to look annoyed with me. He waved me over and said earnestly, "You've been acting a bit strange lately." My expression changed suddenly. Had I been caught secretly checking up on Troy Hart to verify my suspicions? I felt uncertain, but I couldn't back down. I straightened up and shot back, "You're the one being strange." In that fleeting moment, he seemed to notice my change in expression. He pressed on, "I've noticed you've been giving Troy Hart the side eye a lot lately. What's up with that?" "What's up with that? It means I'm into it." But I couldn't say that. Being such an understanding person, I naturally wanted to help keep his little secret, so I sacrificed myself. "I've just been having eye problems lately." To prove my point, I even demonstrated some actual side-eyeing for Robert Carmen. He looked at me suspiciously, paused for a moment, and said in a deep voice, "Come here." I felt a bit guilty because I sensed that something was off with Robert Carmen. I took small steps towards him. Suddenly, Robert Carmen stood up. My instinct told me to back off, but he pulled me in with a firm grip, his warmth radiating through the thin fabric of my nightgown against my skin. I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze. A smooth voice came from above, "Look up." Such close proximity made me uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, trying to prepare myself mentally, but the person in front of me seemed a bit impatient. He grasped my chin, gently lifting my head. I found myself staring straight into his beautiful almond-shaped eyes, which narrowed slightly with a mix of laziness and seriousness. Then, Robert Carmen's face gradually loomed closer, one hand lightly resting on my eyelid, and gently pushing it up. I tensed up completely, feeling utterly helpless as I swallowed again. Every little movement didn't escape Robert Carmen's notice. He smirked softly, his voice laced with amusement. "Your eyes are a bit red." Goodness! With this sudden turn of events, not only were my eyes red, but my entire body felt flushed. I murmured in response. Robert Carmen withdrew his hand, taking a step back, reminding me to rest more as the distance returned. The next day, I found a bottle of eye drops on the dining table. I was unexpectedly touched. During my time living with Robert Carmen, it felt very much like being co-tenants. We rarely saw each other. I kept a regular schedule from 9 to 5, while Robert Carmen was out early and back late. By the time I got up, he had already left, and when I went to bed, he still hadn't returned. The only positive was that every morning, I'd wake up to a ready-made breakfast in the dining room. I smiled to myself. Robert Carmen was quite considerate. Sometimes, I doubted whether he was out secretly dating Troy Hart behind my back. I wanted to tell him it was unnecessary. He could spend the whole night with Troy Hart, and I wouldn't mind, but I could never bring myself to say it. In the end, I asked Troy Hart about it indirectly. It turned out that ever since Robert Carmen got married, he had been working even harder, all for the sake of a wife to support. But Troy Hart was single. He was slogging away with Robert Carmen while hearing about all the lovey-dovey moments. I thought to myself, how secretive Troy Hart must be. Their relationship was hidden even from me, his arranged marriage partner. Such heartbreak. Holding my new bank card with a warm balance of 20,000 yuan, I suddenly felt Robert Carmen's struggles. As an heir growing up rich, how hard he worked. Who else if not him? Sympathy aside, it didn't stop me from spending his money. After marrying Robert Carmen, the thing I did most often was brag. Of course, bragging costs money. Being pretty as a girl can easily create enemies. Since childhood, because of my looks, I have faced all kinds of sour remarks. But now that I was flourishing, I made a list, meeting each of those who had wronged me for a chat. I held up carefully edited photos of my wedding registration with Robert Carmen, blushing as I explained that I recently tied the knot. "My husband isn't anything special, just looks like Wu Yanzu, really rich, and the most important thing is he dotes on me, fulfilling my every wish." I then conveniently showed off the flashy diamond ring I bought online for just 9 yuan. The girls' eyes went wide when they saw Robert Carmen's photo, then turned green when they looked at me. When they spotted the diamond ring on my hand, their faces darkened. and one by one, they stomped away on their high heels. Seething with anger, it felt great. The feeling of making others uncomfortable was truly exhilarating. But I wasn't that skilled. I stared at the list in my hand, which had only lasted for 2 weeks, and lamented that my life felt a bit like a failure. Just then, a timid little girl approached me and asked, "Sister, can we share a table?" Of course we could. Not only did we share a table, but I also treated the little girl to a deluxe meal, and passionately shared some tips on how to deal with men. What followed was me being dragged away by Robert Carmen, who pulled me into his car. Knowing I was in the wrong, I didn't resist at all. Once inside the car, Robert Carmen didn't start it right away. Confused, I looked at him. Just then, he gazed back at me, but his attention was on my hand. Seeing the shimmering diamond ring, I quickly took it off and shoved it into my bag, saying, "Just a prop." Robert Carmen frowned slightly, a brief wave of sadness and guilt passing over his face. His eyes remained on my hand, but now it was completely bare. After a long silence, Robert Carmen finally started the car. The interior was deathly silent. Just as I was about to break the tension, a cold voice came from next to me. "I'm sorry." I looked at Robert Carmen with suspicion, disbelief etched on my face. What was going on with him today? Had he gone soft? No, I couldn't handle that. True to my expectations, Robert Carmen soon reverted to his previous self. "Don't wear that thing again. It's mine to throw away." It turned out, that was still the sort of thing I found comforting. As he said that, he drove into a mall. I followed him into a store, and the moment I saw the logo at the entrance, my eyelids began to twitch. When the sales lady saw Robert Carmen dressed impeccably, her smile could have reached the back of her head. I matched his every step, watching as the price tags rose higher until they stopped at the most expensive section. I wrapped my arms around myself, watching Robert Carmen as he carefully selected items. Whoa, what a fat sheep waiting for slaughter. Feeling my eager gaze, Robert Carmen turned around. The fat sheep spoke. "Why are you just standing there? Come here." Still an angry sheep, I took a couple of steps forward. Robert Carmen took a ring from the sales lady and roughly placed it on my finger. "Does it look good?" I had to admit, that man had great taste. The finely sparkling diamonds spread evenly, making my slender fingers appear even fairer. Under the sunlight, they shone even brighter. I nodded in satisfaction. "I like it." Turning around, I noticed Robert Carmen was also wearing the same plain wedding band. It looked exceptionally good on his defined fingers. He would definitely qualify as a hand model. "Wrap it all up." "Wait," I hastily interrupted, glancing nervously at the several zeros on the price tag, my voice trembling. "You're not suggesting we split the bill, are you?" As I started to take off the ring, I blurted out, "Actually, I don't really need it." "Oh no, I wanted it, but I couldn't afford it." But Robert Carmen's hand pressed down on mine firmly, a light smile gracing his lips as he said in a tone as sweet as honey, "Hubby will buy it for you." With a domineering flair, Robert Carmen pulled out a card and handed it to the beaming sales lady. Truly, men were most handsome when they swiped their cards. After leaving the store, I felt as if I had stepped into another world. Glancing back reluctantly for one last look. "What's wrong?" Robert Carmen followed my gaze but saw nothing unusual. I sighed heavily. It's my first time in a luxury store, and I was only in there for 5 minutes. I feel a bit robbed. Seeing my pitiful demeanor, Robert Carmen tousled my hair tenderly, speaking in an utterly doting tone. "Let's come here often in the future." I was so enthralled by the glittering ring that I overlooked the rare tenderness from Robert Carmen. When I turned back to look at him, everything returned to normalcy. But for some reason, today Robert Carmen seemed to smile particularly brightly, and he looked handsome. After we entered the realm of legal marriage, aside from accompanying Robert Carmen to some business banquets, I didn't need to fulfill any other obligations. One day, as usual, I stood beside Robert Carmen, playing the supportive role. I didn't expect to run into Bradley Penn here. Bradley Penn was my unfaithful ex-boyfriend, who ditched me after climbing the social ladder. I really didn't want to see Bradley Penn, not because I hated him, but seeing him reminded me just how humiliating those times were. I quickly grabbed Robert Carmen's arm and quickened my pace, wishing to avoid him altogether. Noticing my change in demeanor, Robert Carmen softly asked. What's wrong? I ignored him, but my steps grew even quicker. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the air. Joan Austen. I sighed deeply. Just what I feared had happened. Taking a deep breath, I turned around and pretended to be surprised as I greeted my scumbag ex. Robert Carmen observed my fake smile and, while keeping his demeanor calm, nudged me with his elbow. Aren't you going to introduce us? I shot him an irritated glance, my smile becoming even more strained. Bradley Penn added fuel to the fire. By the way, Joan Austen, introduce me. Looking left and right, I thought, how nice. I'd like to introduce my husband, Robert Carmen, and my ex-boyfriend, Bradley Penn. Robert Carmen reached out his hand. Hello, ex-boyfriend. He emphasized the ex, seeming to have a hidden meaning. The smile on Bradley Penn's face vanished instantly. His expression turned icy. Trying to suppress my laughter, I found Robert Carmen quite amusing. This comforting moment didn't last long. Soon Robert Carmen was whisked away to discuss business with a longtime partner, leaving me momentarily elated. Just then, Bradley Penn suddenly approached me and whispered, "Let's meet on the balcony." I turned to watch his retreating figure, utterly baffled. There was no chance of meeting my ex in the presence of my current husband on a balcony. I could easily guess what would unfold next. No way in hell was I going to meet him there. I ignored Bradley Penn and wandered alone around the spacious hall, enjoying some cake and drinks before finding an empty corner to rest on a sofa. Suddenly, a shadow flashed by, and I felt a sharp pain in my wrist. I stumbled forward, colliding against the wall until the grasp on my wrist finally loosened. I could only see his back, but I recognized him. I looked around at my surroundings, a small, dimly lit rectangular area, completely enveloped in darkness. My first thought was, it's a dark, stormy night. Is this a murder scene? Had Bradley Penn lost his mind? Goosebumps covered my skin. I needed to get out of here. Just as I took a step forward, that powerfully gripping hand pulled me back. I shook off that hand, rubbing my sore wrist, and exploded in anger. Bradley Penn, are you insane? Bradley Penn turned and walked towards me step by step. A massive sense of pressure loomed over me, making me step back until my back hit the railings. Pinned against it as I stared directly at him, Bradley Penn suddenly spoke, calling out my name in a low tone. Joan Austen. It sent a shiver down my spine. I had no intention of dragging this out any longer. I cut straight to the point. Bradley Penn, if you have something to say, just say it. He didn't waste time, and Bradley Penn started reaching for me again. He grabbed my wrist, rambling on. Joan Austen, I was wrong. I was blinded by power when I married Olivia, but I'm not happy at all. Her family looks down on me, always treating me like an outsider. I understood now. This guy was trying to milk sympathy. I rolled my eyes, my patience wearing thin, and interrupted him. Bradley Penn, I don't have time for your sob story. Seeing my distaste, Bradley Penn grew anxious, revealing his true intentions. Joan Austen, let's reconcile. Let's go back to how it used to be. Okay. My last bit of patience drained away, and looking at the features that once seemed familiar, but now felt utterly strange and ridiculous, I raised my chin slightly to meet his gaze. Bradley Penn, you have a wife. I have a husband. How can we go back to the way things were? Hearing this, Bradley Penn looked around to ensure no one was nearby, then said, Joan Austen, we just can't let them know. Perhaps sensing a glimmer of hope, he pressed on. Joan Austen, you know I care about you. I've always cared about you. You're the only one in my heart. Disgusted, I felt genuinely repulsed. I stared coldly at him. Bradley Penn, you're such a traitor. You're living off Olivia's family but still longing for another flower outside. Why don't you look in the mirror and see if you're even worthy? You. Bradley Penn was left speechless, and out of shame and anger, he raised his hand, attempting to hit me, but that hand lingered in the air, frozen midway. Looking at the newcomer, I couldn't help but admire how handsome my man actually was. Robert Carmen shook off Bradley Penn's hand, and turned to throw a punch at his face, coldly stating, get lost. Realizing he'd lost face, Bradley Penn covered his cheek and left in disgrace. Clapping my hands, I looked at the tall, leggy man before me, praising him. That was impressive. From the moment he arrived, Robert Carmen had not looked pleased, and his expression hadn't softened even slightly. In fact, he seemed colder than the dark night. I felt it was my duty to lighten the mood. You were really heroic just now. I was saving someone, not being a hero. The excitement I had just moments ago faded instantly, and I refused to back down. Hope you didn't freeze standing by the door listening. Robert Carmen. Robert Carmen raised an eyebrow and smiled wickedly. Did you see? I wasn't frozen, but I was thoroughly disgusted. You want a man like that? Desperate times call for desperate measures. Sorry for my earlier, naive infatuation. Men really shouldn't be spoiled. Robert Carmen is truly petty. He was still giving me the cold shoulder when we got home. I'm not someone who can be easily controlled. I strode forward angrily, but before I could speak, he cut me off. Do you realize your mistake? Robert Carmen sat comfortably on the couch, like a rich landlord. I was about to explode. What mistake? You've been wearing a sour face this whole time. Second, after marriage, the couple must maintain proper conduct. During the duration of the marriage, neither party may engage in flirtation or infidelity with anyone else. If discovered, the other party may decide to void the marriage. As expected, Robert Carmen, being a lawyer, could recite such a long statement word for word, but this wasn't a moment for flattery. I stepped closer. Did you not hear everything outside? It's clearly Bradley Penn, who won't take no for an answer. Robert Carmen shot me a glance, his meaning quite clear. A fly doesn't buzz around an egg without flaws. You're the egg. Your whole family is eggs. I grabbed a throw pillow and without thinking, threw it at him, hitting him squarely in the face. Still not satisfied, I picked up another one, but before I could throw it, a force pulled my wrist forward. In the next moment, I found myself sitting on Robert Carmen's lap. Just as I was about to get up, a powerful arm locked around my waist, making me unable to move. I blushed and pushed against him. Robert Carmen, let me go. Oh no. Now we were even closer. Just then, a calm voice came from above, still causing trouble. I pouted and mumbled softly, I'm not wrong. Robert Carmen reached up to touch my head, surprisingly trying to comfort me. All right, you're not wrong, but stay away from that person next time. I was seriously suspicious that Robert Carmen had kept a dog before. His current gentleness felt like petting, but I couldn't help it. I was lost in Robert Carmen's tenderness. I nodded obediently. This Saturday, my mom is coming back to the country. Coincidentally, your parents are also back from their trip. How about we have dinner together? I nodded again. Robert Carmen looked satisfied as he shifted to the left, making room for me. Wait a minute. What did Robert Carmen just say? Meeting the parents. This is getting serious. I blankly stared at Robert Carmen, stuttering, I can't. I was already scared of marriage. Even though Robert Carmen and I had haphazardly gotten our marriage certificate, it didn't feel real. The sudden suggestion of meeting his mom filled my mind with various nightmarish mother-in-law stereotypes I'd seen on TV, and all my fears came rushing back. My mom is really nice. I can't. My mom will definitely like you. I can't. My mom, Robert Carmen. Let's get a divorce. I blurted it out without thinking. Robert Carmen's face visibly changed, his eyes showing a loneliness and pain I had never seen before. It seemed he wanted to say something, but ultimately he remained silent and quietly stood up to leave. Watching his solitary figure walk away, my heart ached sharply, more than when I learned about Bradley Penn's infidelity. I chased after him, opening the door to our room. It was dark inside. Robert Carmen sat on the edge of the bed with his back to me, so I couldn't see his expression, only the faint glow of his cigarette embers. This was the first time I had seen Robert Carmen smoking. Tentatively, I spoke. Robert Carmen. That silhouette didn't move. I walked around the bed to his side, where Robert Carmen's head was bowed, inhaling his cigarette. I had never seen Robert Carmen looking this defeated. My heart twisted painfully. I'm sorry. Robert Carmen continued to ignore me, inhaling his smoke faster, soon finishing off the cigarette. He reached for another one nearby. I knelt beside him and pressed my hand down on his. Stop smoking. A mocking laugh bubbled up in the dark. Joan Austen, who do you think you are to tell me what to do? He leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us. The smoke rings he exhaled creating a mesmerizing cloud around me. Aren't you getting a divorce? Each word pricked my heart like a needle, making me feel suddenly wronged, and tears began streaming down my face. Perhaps it was too quiet that night. I could hear the soft patter of my tears on the floor. Robert Carmen sighed, reaching up to gently wipe the tears from my face, his voice softening. You hurt me. Why are you still crying? The more he spoke, the harder I cried until I was sobbing. Robert Carmen helplessly patted my back to comfort me. Hey, don't cry, okay? I gradually stopped crying, wiping my face with my sleeve. Robert Carmen chuckled softly. Still want a divorce? My voice was muffled after crying, and I shook my head vigorously. Not anymore. Robert Carmen pulled me into his embrace, and I caught the faint scent of smoke on him, which somehow felt nice. This matter is off the table from now on. I nestled into his shoulder, muffled. Okay. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought a lot but still couldn't figure out Robert Carmen. His attitude toward me was so inconsistent that my heart felt tightly wounded, and then relaxed over and over. Soon it was Saturday. Robert Carmen and I got up early to pick up his mother from the airport. On the way, I was in a high state of anxiety about meeting my future mother-in-law. Robert Carmen gently patted my hand, reassuring me, don't be nervous. Suddenly, I asked, what if I get into a fight with your mom? Robert Carmen burst into laughter, and I had never seen him so genuinely happy, but I was about to cry. What if both your mom and I fell into the water? What if your mom disagrees with us being together? What if your mom doesn't like me? I babbled on all the way, but when we finally picked up Robert Carmen's mom, I was no longer nervous, because his mom was stunningly beautiful, looking very young with an impressive presence. I immediately understood why Robert Carmen looked the way he did. His mom contributed most of that. I got so excited. Some words slipped out. Hello, Auntie. Robert Carmen frowned at me, as if he were looking at a fool. Receiving the cue, I quickly corrected myself and sweetly said, Mom. Charlotte Kellogg seemed unconcerned. She was thrilled to see me, showering me with compliments about my looks, and then pulled out a red envelope from her bag, insisting I take it. Take this as a courtesy for calling me Mom. Good kid. Go on. After feigning some reluctance, I happily accepted it. It felt quite thick when I squeezed it. Robert Carmen shook his head, helplessly watching my foolishness. The two families met at a pre-arranged hotel, and everything went far more smoothly than I had imagined. When my mom saw Robert Carmen, she wouldn't let go. Robert Carmen's mom clung to me as well. My mom lamented about how she'd always wanted a son, and now she had a son-in-law who was just like a son, liking him more with every glance. Robert Carmen's mom reminisced about wanting a daughter, and now gained a beloved little daughter. She was practically dreaming. Robert Carmen and I sat on the side, promptly catching goosebumps. Meanwhile, my dad was contentedly sitting across from us, munching on sunflower seeds and watching the mutual flattery. The families parted ways in warmth and mirth. My parents cheerfully headed home, while Charlotte Kellogg hurriedly left. I couldn't help but admire how carefree my mother-in-law was, to travel all the way across the ocean just to see her daughter-in-law and give her a big red envelope. But this was in line with Charlotte Kellogg's personality. Robert Carmen once told me that when he was 15, his father's affair was discovered, and his mother immediately asked for a divorce, taking him away to America, where she found a good man and settled down, creating a happy family and career. After Charlotte Kellogg left, life returned to normal for Robert Carmen and me. Today was the same as usual as I got off work and came home, but when I opened the bedroom door, I was instantly stunned. A bare man, oh no, half naked, was right in front of me. After moving into Robert Carmen's home, I had occupied the master bedroom because it had a private bathroom, making my washing routine easier. Naturally, Robert Carmen got the guest room. The living room had a public bathroom, so he rarely came into my room, let alone in such a state of undress. The half-naked man spoke. Shut your mouth. I obediently closed my open mouth, almost gasping out in surprise. It wasn't that I hadn't seen a man before, it was that this man was too tempting, with slightly wet hair, broad shoulders, and a narrower waist. Six-pack abs became more defined with every movement, the perfect balance of hard and soft. And further down, don't expect anything. Further down was a towel tightly wrapped. I told myself not to let myself be seduced by male beauty. I forced myself to return to reality. What are you doing here? Taking a shower. I was in a panic. Can't you just use the public bathroom? Robert Carmen remained calm. The shower's broken. He glanced at me and suddenly said something cryptic. Have you had enough of the view? For once, I gathered my courage. I haven't had enough. Robert Carmen smirked. Do you want to see more? I didn't know where my courage came from, but I nodded straight away. Robert Carmen's lips curved, and he took closer steps toward me, backing me against the door with nowhere to retreat. I watched, wide-eyed, as those six-pack abs drew ever closer, water droplets cascading down from his hair, along his sculpted chest and abs. I turned away, my cheeks burning red. Robert Carmen stopped just a step away from me, his breath fanning my face. Is it nice? A wave of heat washed over me, and all my earlier courage evaporated. Shivering and unable to turn back, I stiffly replied, It's nice. Suddenly, everything went dark, something blocking my view, and all of my breath was thrown into chaos. Robert Carmen drew near, brushing my hair aside, murmuring, There's something there. I snapped back to reality. In such an important moment, he chooses to comment on something there. This wasn't something a normal man would do. To prove my guess, in the next second, Robert Carmen pushed me aside and walked out the door. I stood there dazed, listening to my heart pounding. In 1 minute, it beat 120 times, 45 beats faster than usual. I was doomed. I had been blinded by male beauty. That entire night, whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Robert Carmen's bare chest and those rippling abs, accompanied by his captivating voice murmuring, Is it nice? Unless something went wrong, I had a dreamy night filled with spring dreams. Early the next morning, I left the house looking like a raccoon with 2 big dark circles under my eyes. That's when I ran into the male lead from my spring dream sitting in the dining room. Robert Carmen sat upright at the table, fully dressed, but to me, he might as well have been naked even in his clothes. I didn't have to look at him to picture those six-pack abs. Just looking at him made me see them beneath the fabric. I sat across from him, gnawing on a piece of bread while studying his stunning face, and secretly made a decision. I have to win over Robert Carmen. As the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you can fight 100 battles without disaster. To catch a big fish, one must first enter the tiger's den. The first step was to infiltrate the enemy's territory, gather information, and figure out the way in. That very morning, I stormed into my rival's office clutching a bubble tea. And what a coincidence! The target was also there. Robert Carmen's expression suddenly darkened. He glanced at me, then at Troy Hart, then back at the 2 cups of bubble tea in my hands. Just as I was about to explain, Robert Carmen turned on his heel and walked away, casually snatching 1 cup of bubble tea from me as he passed. Forget it, we're all family, no hard feelings. I stared at the remaining cup of bubble tea for a second before deciding to prioritize the bigger picture. I placed the drink on Troy Hart's desk, pulled up a chair next to him, and feigned a humble eagerness to learn. Troy Hart leaned back leisurely and said, So, what's up? After a brief hesitation, I decided not to beat around the bush. Troy Hart had just taken a sip when he suddenly sprayed bubble tea all over me, right on my face. The tapioca pearls bounced off and rolled around on the floor. Great, just what I needed, an effective separation of dry and wet. As he doubled over with laughter, pounding his thigh, he grabbed a tissue and swiped at my face haphazardly. What were you thinking? He chuckled, with a Mona Lisa-like smile. I looked at him kindly, then turned, and dumped the remaining bubble tea all over Troy Hart's pants. I've said it before, a woman's vengeance knows no pause. Just like that, my plan to conquer Robert Carmen ended before it even began. Even worse, that evening, the tables turned, and I found myself under attack from Robert Carmen, seizing territory. I lost my defenses. Robert Carmen leaned in closer, teasingly asking, I heard you question me. In the face of his imposing aura, I stammered, didn't I? Robert Carmen twirled a loose strand of my hair around his finger, a low voice drifting down from above. Want to give it a try? Startled yet emboldened, I wrapped my arms around his neck and yanked him down, a cool sensation spreading over my lips as I kissed him, feeling both guilty and anxious. The worst part, I heard his low chuckle escaping from his lips. Ouch! My face instantly flushed like a ripe persimmon. Any courage I had vanished into thin air. And just as I was about to pull away, a sudden grip held my neck, rendering me immobile. Robert Carmen flipped the situation back on me, thinking of escaping. It's too late. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as I turned to look at the man still asleep beside me, feeling unsure whether to be happy or sad. While I stared blankly at the ceiling, I suddenly fell into a familiar embrace. You're awake. Robert Carmen had just woken up, his voice still hoarse but surprisingly captivating. Looking at his handsome face, the little bit of sadness vanished without a trace. So what if we slept together? It's not every day you get to share a bed with a guy like him. Then I remembered something and poked his palm. You broke your promise. Aha! His voice rose at the end, sending pleasant shivers down my spine. I steadied myself and reminded him. The first rule. Robert Carmen remained unfazed, asking in return, what's wrong? You've crossed the line. I reiterated my warning. Oh! His tone rose again, stirring my heart yet again. Robert Carmen gazed at me, slowly adding, that's a basic duty of a wife. I pulled away from his embrace, glaring at him angrily. You didn't say that before, did I? Robert Carmen wore a cheeky grin and added, wife, you should learn the law a bit, otherwise, you might get tricked. Frustration flooded my mind, and I jumped out of bed, shouting, you tricked me into marriage. The moment those words left my lips, I collapsed. After the exhausting night, my body ached all over. I suddenly got up, stumbled, and fell right into Robert Carmen's arms, embracing me willingly. He teased, oh no, oh no. I truly felt like crying without tears. Robert Carmen suddenly leaned in closer. Wife, let me teach you a bit about the law. That sent alarm bells ringing in my head, and I shook my head repeatedly. No, no, wife, allow me to demonstrate and show you the duties of a wife. No, really, wife, being legally ignorant is shameful. No, wife. Fine then, let's go. After a deep dive into our rights and responsibilities, our relationship progressed by leaps and bounds. To be specific, Robert Carmen had officially moved into the master bedroom. To be even more specific, Robert Carmen was now lying right next to me, curled up in his embrace. I found myself filled with endless questions, finally deciding to ask, why did you marry me in the first place? Robert Carmen looked down, gently stroking my hair, his voice laced with lingering desire. You really have no heart. How could this man be so sweet one moment and so contradictory the next, as if flattering me when it's convenient? Noticing my frustration, Robert Carmen let out a low laugh that echoed in my ears, further igniting my irritation. I retaliated by pinching his love handles. He winced in pain and shot upright, only for me to be pinned down again an instant later. Our gazes locked. Robert Carmen's eyes took on that familiar, heated glint again, causing my pulse to race. Exhausted, I pushed against his waist gently while sweetly complaining, I'm tired. His beautiful eyes crinkled at the corners, a soft starlight reflecting in them that was even gentler than the moonlight. Nothing in the world could compare. Robert Carmen swung back to lie on the bed, stretching his long arm to pull me back into his embrace. Looks like you really don't remember. Puzzled, I turned my head to look at him. Robert Carmen didn't meet my gaze, his stare fixed outside the window. Drifting into a memory, do you recall that boy next door, who always stood up for you? As a child, my parents were often busy, constantly moving, so I was either relocating or on the way to a new home, resulting in many neighbors. When I thought back, it indeed rang a bell. It really did happen a long time ago. There was one when I just transferred to 4th grade. Cliques ran rampant in class, and no one wanted to play with me. I was bullied a lot, but that neighboring boy would often step in to help chase those bullies away. The realization hit me suddenly. How did you know about that? Robert Carmen gently tapped my forehead with his finger, his tone softening. How could you be so clueless? I widened my eyes, staring at the face so close to mine, gradually merging it with that of the boy from my memories. There was definitely a resemblance. Hesitant, I asked, you can't be that boy, can you? He raised an eyebrow. Oh, finally remembered. I broke free from his embrace and sat up excitedly. But wait, I clearly remember that boy had a different name. Robert Carmen tugged me back, tucking the blanket around me. Didn't I tell you my parents divorced? I went with my mom, who later changed my name. Feeling a pang of nostalgia from my first encounter with my future mother-in-law, I was secretly thrilled, never expecting my childhood friend scenario would play out in my life. I loved this concept way too much. I snuggled deeper into Robert Carmen's arms. When did you realize it was me? The first time I saw you, during the matchmaking. He shook his head. I had seen your photo before that. The realization hit me like thunder, shattering the beautiful bubble of childhood sweetness. I could guarantee that photo came straight from my scheming mother, and I was certain that photo would be unforgettable. Sure enough, Robert Carmen bit his lip, suppressing a smile. There you were in pajamas, hair in a ponytail, something in your mouth, looking just like a little hamster, exactly the same as back then. Well, it was no surprise. That was my mom's style. Robert Carmen continued. The day of the matchmaking, I recognized you immediately. Even your cries matched perfectly with the little cribbaby you used to be. I also had to thank my mom for unwittingly finding me such a good husband. Your mom recognized me right away when she saw my photo, which is why she felt comfortable handing you over to me. Unlike some people who say they're heartless, can't tell the truth. Heh. Robert Carmen shot me a teasing glance. I nodded, smiling awkwardly, swaying between repentance and complimenting his good taste. I still had one lingering question. Why did it seem like our families didn't know each other when we met? Robert Carmen gave me a knowing look. Are they pretending? Robert Carmen gently kissed my forehead. Understandable. The story concludes here. Feel free to subscribe to the channel for the latest updates, with a plethora of novels updated daily.